Boldwood presents Winter Whimsy on the Boardwalk, written by Georgina Troy and read by Sophie Dora Hall. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. December. Lexi opened the front door to her end of terrace fisherman's cottage and gazed down the hill towards the boardwalk. She took a deep, bracing breath as she watched the rough sea crashing against the cliff face near the small beach where she had spent almost every day of her life. She loved it here. These cottages had been the only constant in her life, especially since her mother had passed away suddenly in a car accident 2 years ago. She had focused a lot of her time on her dad since then, and with the help of her best friends, Sasha, Bella and Jules, had slowly found a way to get by without her fun-loving mother in her life. Now, though, her father had found himself a girlfriend Lexi simply couldn't take to. She recalled a conversation with Bella the night before, when they'd met for a couple of drinks in the Ploughman's pub. "I don't know what it is about Gloria," she'd admitted guiltily, "but there's something about her I'm not keen on. I've thought about it, and it's not because she's the first woman Dad has gone out with since Mum." "I know that," Bella had said, having taken a few hours away from her boyfriend and stock-taking for the tiny antique shop she ran from the living room of her blue cottage on the boardwalk. She took a sip of her white wine. "I bumped into them at the newsagent's the other day. She seemed very pleased with herself about something. Maybe she's more fun than we imagine." They'd stared at each other in silence briefly, both processing Bella's comment. "I don't mean sexually," Bella grimaced. "Just that we might not have seen the best side to her, that's all." Lexi hadn't let herself think about her father actually being intimate with anyone, let alone Gloria. "Gross," she shuddered. "Thanks for putting that thought into my head." Bella had giggled. "You have to remember he's only 50-something, and I guess attractive in an eccentric, arty, odd sort of way." "Maybe that's because he is a little odd and an artist," Lexi said fondly, still struggling to shake off the thought of her father doing anything remotely physical with his girlfriend. "Anyway, I don't think she likes me either." "She probably sees you as competition for his attention." Bella leant in closer to Lexi. "You're an only child, and maybe she thinks he's got money, seeing as his paintings sell quite well." They had done, but not recently, Lexi had realised. She'd confided her thoughts to her friend. "Since Mum died, he's found it difficult to paint. He always said she was his muse from when they met at 17. Now she's gone, he's lost his inspiration to paint. It's so sad," she added, swallowing tears. "Well," Bella placed a hand on Lexi's and gave it a gentle pat. "And I know you won't like me saying this, but as your friend, I feel I should." "Go on," Lexi said, suspecting she knew where the conversation was going. "Maybe this girlfriend will spark off feelings in him that will help him get into his painting again. Surely it would be a good thing for your dad. What do you think?" Lexi couldn't ignore that what Bella had said made sense, and however distasteful it may be to her to think of him replacing her mother with another muse, she needed to be grateful if he had found some way of moving on and resuming his artistic passions. She was also aware he needed to begin making an income for himself again. "Lexi?" She smiled at Bella, not wishing her to think her suggestion had upset her in any way. "You're right, I know you are. And if it helps Dad, then I'll just have to accept it." "Good girl." Bella had risen and walked around the small table to give Lexi a hug. "After all, you have the fishermen's cottages to keep you busy." "Changing the subject away from your dad," she'd said, giving Lexi a wink. "How are things going on that front?" "They're fine." Now it was the following morning, and Lexi cupped her hands and blew on them to warm them up, wishing she had thought to wear gloves to come outside. She looked around at the cottages, grateful to Bella for her comments the night before. It wasn't easy bringing up things that people didn't like to face, and Bella was right. She needed to be happy for her dad if he was finding a way to move on with his life and get his career back on track. Her friend was right too, when she said that Lexi had the fishermen's cottages to focus on. They were her link to her mum, and not only gave her somewhere to live, but also a way to make money, by managing them for holidaymakers. She made herself feel better with the thought that, whatever her father chose to do, she at least had these cottages providing an income. The sound of a car engine coming down the hill distracted her. She turned and saw a taxi, surprised when it slowed and stopped at the end of her pathway. She hadn't been expecting any visitors to come and stay today. She tried not to appear too obvious as she peered in the taxi's direction, shocked to see that the man getting out of the vehicle was none other than Oliver Whimsy. What the hell was he doing here? She tried to recall whether he had booked the cottage at the end of the row, where she had allowed him to stay for a couple of nights a few weeks earlier. Or had she simply forgotten him booking a return? No, she was sure she hadn't. Lexi watched him pay the taxi driver and then carry his large suitcase towards her. He looked as if he prepared to come for some time. The thought worried her. He gave her a brief smile. "It's freezing out here," he said, shivering despite his bespoke overcoat, which Lexi suspected was made of something exorbitantly expensive, like cashmere. "Do you mind if we go inside straight away? We can sign any paperwork then." "Sorry?" He lowered his case and rubbed his gloved hands together. "Can I take it that you weren't expecting me?" "No, I wasn't." She was confused. "Have you booked?" He took a deep breath and sighed. "I'm guessing your father hasn't told you what's happened, has he?" An unnerving thought occurred to Lexi. To most people, her father was outgoing and charismatic, though at times a little dippy. What they didn't realise was that he could also be cowardly when it came to confrontation and avoided it at all costs. And she knew of old that if Oliver Whimsy was here and she knew nothing about it, then her father had made arrangements that he knew she wouldn't like. Dread pulled at her stomach like a vice slowly tightening. "I have a horrible suspicion I'm not going to like this." She turned around and opened her front door, stepping back to wave Oliver in. "You may as well come inside. It's too cold out here. We probably have quite a bit to discuss." His face clouded over, and he picked up his bag and went inside. She stepped in behind him and closed the door, using the few seconds it took her to take off her coat to try and gather her thoughts and prepare for what was to come. "Please," she said, joining him in the small open-plan living room and kitchen area. "Take a seat." She watched him, unable to ignore how attractive he was, over 6 foot tall and dark-haired with piercing blue eyes. "Can I make you a coffee? You look frozen." She may as well be neighbourly, she thought, at least initially. "Yes, please. I could do with one." Lexi busied herself at the kettle. "It's instant, I'm afraid." "No problem." She wasn't so sure. She stirred the drinks and handed one mug to him before sitting down opposite and waiting for what he had to tell her. He stared silently at his drink. She could see he was mulling something over. Eventually he looked across the small space at her. Lexi crossed her legs, wishing he would hurry up. "I think it's time to tell me exactly what my father has arranged with you. Not," she added, aware she wasn't being as hospitable as she usually was to her tenants, "that I mind you being here. In fact, all 3 cottages are empty, so I'm more than happy for you to rent one of them. But I would like to know why you're here." He straightened up slightly in his chair. She was beginning to think he might feel even more uncomfortable than she did. She hoped it wasn't her chairs. No one else had complained about them. In fact, everyone remarked on how comfortable they were in the short surveys she left for tenants to complete. She realised she was being ridiculous and waited impatiently for him to speak. He took a deep breath. "Your father hasn't mentioned that he's coming down here this morning to speak to you." She shook her head. "Right." She saw a muscle working in his jaw. He was angry, but why? "I don't know how else to say this," he said, leaning slightly forward in his chair. "I assume you're aware that I now own these cottages." He watched her silently. Lexi had heard the words coming out of his mouth. She even understood what they meant. Somehow, though, she could not make her brain take in the reality of them. Lexi could imagine her father renting one of the cottages to Oliver, probably for less than he should, despite knowing she wouldn't like it. It never occurred to her that her father could betray her in this way, though. Oliver Whimsy, she decided, had to be wrong. "I think there must be some misunderstanding between you and my dad." She willed him to agree with her. Instead, he shook his head slowly. Looking down briefly at his mug of coffee, he seemed to be struggling to find the right words. Eventually, he looked up at her. "I'm dreadfully sorry. I can see that you're not happy with this news. I am, however, the new owner. The sale was completed last week." For a few seconds it was as if her head was in a bubble. "He can't have," she said, her voice a high-pitched squeak. She swallowed a mouthful of coffee, trying her best to hide how much it stung as the steaming liquid scalded her throat. The pain distracted her from the tears that threatened to come. He has. Oliver looked, she thought, as if he could kill someone. He led me to believe that you were fully aware of the transaction. I'm sorry, he said, looking angry. I think you need to discuss this with your father before we speak further. Can you let me know which cottage I can take my things to while you call him? I'm staying in this one right now, she explained, her attention turning to a silver-framed photograph of her grandmother and mother beaming at Lexi from the mantelpiece when she was around 4 years old, as she danced on the lawn in front of the cottages. She liked to keep them as free from her personal effects as possible, in case she didn't have much time to make the place up for her new holidaymaker. This photo, however, went everywhere with her. It represented her happiest times with the two women who loved her above all else. She realised he was waiting for her to speak, so looked at him and continued. I live here when it's empty so that I can keep an eye on the rest. Her throat constricted with unshed tears. She coughed lightly, determined to know why he had bought the cottages. I don't understand why you want them. They're tiny for a start, and you've only ever stayed here for a couple of nights. She could hear the bitterness in her own voice and was embarrassed. It wasn't Oliver Whimsy's fault that her father had sold them to him. Lexi gave him a tight smile to soften her words. It's personal, he said, after a moment's hesitation. Personal? What reason on earth could he have to feel connected to these cottages? As far as she was aware, he had no family on the island, and it wasn't as if he had shown any attraction to her. In any case, Lexi thought angrily, if he did like her, which she was certain he didn't, not in that way, then that still wasn't reason enough to pay what must have been a lot of money for this tiny terrace. He shifted in his chair. I'm sorry, but I'd rather not say why. She stared at him, willing him to change his mind. She wasn't satisfied with his answer, but could tell that he wasn't going to add anything further. Fine. It wasn't at all, but what could she do about it now? It occurred to her that if Oliver Whimsy was the new owner, then he wouldn't need her hanging about. She put her mug down on the table next to her. The last thing she wanted was to get upset in front of a relative stranger, especially Oliver Whimsy. She thought back to the first time she'd met him, at the recent Halloween party that Jack Collins' ex-girlfriend Nikki had held. No one on the boardwalk liked Nikki, simply because there was nothing much to like. Also because she tried to cause trouble for Jack, Sasha's twin, and the man who Bella had been seeing for the past few weeks. Despite all that, when Nikki had called Oliver Whimsy over to join her on the dance floor that night and proposed marriage, he'd stunned everyone by glaring at her before walking away, leaving Nikki standing alone in front of all the guests. It was not the act of a gentleman, they had all agreed. Regardless of his good looks, his actions had made him unattractive to everyone. This was despite them agreeing that Nikki had put him in a very difficult position. Lexi thought back to that night when, unable to stay at the hotel any longer and needing somewhere to stay, Oliver had turned up at the cottages. He had explained to her that there was nothing going on between him and Nikki, and that the proposal had been, in his opinion, simply to antagonise Jack. He ended up asking if he could spend a couple of nights in the end property. Despite thinking he could have handled things better with Nikki, Lexi had let him stay. However badly she thought he had behaved, she could not knowingly let him or anyone else find themselves without a roof over their head. But now, it seemed, he had liked the fishermen's cottages so much he had bought them. She felt as if someone had punched her in the stomach. Look, why don't I take you to the cottage you stayed in before? She said, desperate to remove him from her home. Well, home for now, she thought. She was determined not to show him how stunned she was. I'll come and set the place up for you before I go and speak to my dad. That's very kind, especially under the circumstances. Thank you. Leading the way through to the hall, Lexi took the cottage keys from the window ledge. I'll make up the bed and then pop out and fetch a few essentials for you, so you have something in the cupboard and the fridge. She needed a little time to think through what she was going to say to her father. Also, time to let the shock sink in about what he'd done and the repercussions his decision would have on her life. What had he been thinking, selling her mother's cottages and without consulting her first? He knew it was her livelihood and, more often than not, her home. She stood in the hall, trying to regulate her breathing. She didn't want Oliver to know how the sale would devastate her, although he'd probably already guessed. She heard him pick up his case, and without another word, opened the front door and led him to the end cottage, unlocking it and letting him in. "We always keep the heating on, although it's rather low now. I'll turn it up a bit," she said, going to the thermostat. "We never turn it off completely in case there's a sudden dip in the temperature outside." She wondered why he was being so helpful under the circumstances. "We don't want the pipes freezing. The frost we sometimes get here can lead to burst pipes, and living so close to the sea on this hill, we sometimes get the full force of the winds coming in from the channel." She knew she was waffling. "If you want to make yourself comfortable, I'll quickly go to make up your bedroom. I keep the sheets and the towels for each cottage in their own airing cupboards, so everything's already here." She didn't know why she was explaining this to him. It wasn't as if he needed to know. But it kept her mind from focusing on the nagging thought that she was now having to face being homeless herself. Lexi hated the thought of moving back into her father's house, especially now Gloria had essentially moved in. It wasn't the childhood home she remembered anymore. She hadn't lived there much for 5 years now, not since she had taken over the running of the cottages, and the last place she wanted to live was in her father and Gloria's love nest. She shivered at the prospect. Lexi was sure she had been pleasant enough to Gloria when her father had introduced them, so could not understand the woman's dislike of her. Maybe Bella was right, and that being his only child had stirred up a feeling of competition in his girlfriend that wasn't necessary. Or, Lexi wondered, as she took out the sheets and towels from the airing cupboard, it could be that she looked so like her mother. Everyone said so. Could it be the similarity between the two of them that Gloria had an issue with? She focused on making up the double bed in the small but cosy bedroom upstairs, before returning to Oliver Whimsy downstairs. "Right, I'm off to speak to Dad. Then I'll hurry back so I don't keep you waiting too long." "Really, there's no need," he said, opening his case and taking out a shiny laptop. He placed it on the small table next to the armchair by the window and waited for her to make the next move. "I'll be fine here. I've got plenty of work to be catching up on for the next few hours." She forced a smile and left him to get on with his work. Standing outside, Lexi zipped up her coat, battling conflicting emotions, but mainly anger. Overcome by the urge to confront her father, she ran back to her cottage, grabbed her car keys, and drove up the hill to her dad's house. Chapter 2. Lexi parked the car badly but didn't care. She ran inside the bungalow without bothering to knock. She marched into the kitchen looking for her father, and was welcomed by the sight of him snogging Gloria. Lexi stared open-mouthed at the discomforting scene of them, locked in their passionate kiss. Her father froze as Gloria gave her a triumphant smile over his shoulder. Seconds later he sprang back. Any nerves Lexi had about confronting him disappeared. Pure rage coursed through her. She knew without doubt that Gloria had played a part, and no doubt persuaded him that the sale was a good idea. Lexi glared at her. She might be barely above 5 feet in height, but was determined to show Gloria she was a lot tougher than she looked. "I'd like a private word with my father, if you don't mind." "Look, who's come to visit us, Jeff?" Her father shuffled from one foot to the other. He had always left awkward situations for her mother to deal with. After a slight hesitation, he gave Gloria a tilt of his head, indicating she should leave the room. As soon as she'd gone, he folded his arms and leant back against the work surface behind him. "Ah, Lexi, you've heard then?" It was a statement rather than a question, and his attitude infuriated her. What had happened to change him so much? Surely this couldn't all be Gloria's doing. She hoped not, because if that was the case, then the woman had far more influence on her father than Lexi had ever imagined possible. "I don't know what hurts more," she said, glaring at him, shocked to see his arrogant, unrepentant stance. "The fact that you sold Mum's cottages so readily, or that it never occurred to you to mention it to me first." Her father struggled to reply. In the past, he'd spent a lot of time on his art, but was basically lazy when it came to anything else. Maybe his dislike of confronting people was why he decided to act behind her back. "I can't believe you did this," she went on. "You know Mum always intended for me to run the cottages." Her temper rose when he didn't reply. "What do you think Gran would have said if she knew what you'd done?" Her maternal grandmother, Dorothea, known to everyone as Thea, had been a formidable woman. She had never married, and brought up Lexi's mum alone, never thinking anything of it. Thea had always insisted that men were not to be relied upon. Lexi thought back to her earliest memories of different people with colourful lives, coming and going over the weeks and months in the 2 cottages that her gran had rented out as holiday lets from the early 60s, when she had inherited them from her own mother. Her home had been the one at the end, where Lexi now lived. She realised her father was staring, shame-faced, at several blank canvases leant against the wall. "You do realise that I'm now essentially homeless?" she snapped. When he didn't reply, she added, irritated to think that she would now have to share her childhood home with her father and Gloria. "I'll just have to move in here now, won't I?" His mouth fell open in shock. Pleased to finally have some reaction, Lexi didn't wait for him to reply, but marched out of the kitchen, down the short hallway, and burst into her bedroom. At least, into what had been her bedroom the last time she visited. However, instead of being greeted by her old single bed and the faded but familiar flowery wallpaper of her youth, she almost tripped over a stack of canvases waiting to be painted. She turned, coming nose to nose with her father as he raced down the passageway to join her. "Where's my bedroom?" "You moved out," he said, looking a little anxious, "and I needed a bigger studio. Gloria said it made sense to knock through from your room into the studio. I happen to think she was right. It looks rather good." "It does, and generally I'd be very impressed," she said, trying not to lose her temper. "But now that you've got rid of my bedroom and sold my home, where exactly do you think I'll be sleeping from now on?" He chewed the skin at the side of his left thumb. I hadn't thought that far," he answered honestly. "And," she added, as something else occurred to her, "thanks to you and Gloria, I've also now lost my job." Lexi opened her mouth to say something else, when Gloria strode back into the room. The smug expression on her heavily made-up face disappeared the second Lexi's father turned around to look at her. "You poor thing, Lexi," she said, her face the picture of someone who truly was devastated. "You're young, no, and shouldn't have a problem getting a job." She walked up to Lexi's father, and linking her arm through his, gave him a gentle, collaborative smile. "After all, you're a grown woman now, of what, 35? Lexi refused to give her the satisfaction of letting her see how much he was winding her up. After all, that was Gloria's intention. "I'm 29, Gloria." "Yes," Gloria smiled, her perfect white teeth shining brightly in the overcast day. "Then you're more than in age to stand on your own 2 feet. She gave a silly laugh. "I was 18 when I was living in my own home, which I paid for by working. You can't really expect your poor father to still be supporting you at home, not at your age, can you?" Lexi clenched her fists, pushing them deep into her coat pockets. "No, of course I don't expect him to give me a roof over my head. However, as I'm sure you are aware, Gloria, those cottages were my mother's." "But your mother is dead." Gloria raised her thick eyebrows as if to make her point, before she turned on her heels and flounced out of the room. Lexi stared at her father, his mouth open in stunned horror. "Seriously, Dad? I know you're besotted, but are you going to let her get away with saying things like that about Mum?" He cleared his throat and shook his head, looking bewildered. His paint-spattered grey hair stood up at different angles as he pushed his hand through it. "Look, Lex, Gloria didn't mean what she just said. That is, she wouldn't have meant it to come out like it did. She is a good person. She's kind and looks after me very well. And she's right. Your mum is dead and we should both learn to move on with our lives." Lexi could see she was not going to get anywhere. "There's moving on and erasing someone from your life, Dad," she said miserably. She admitted to herself that Gloria had been right when she said that she was now a grown-up. Her father was also entitled to have a girlfriend and a bit of fun in his life. Lexi had just not expected things to turn out how they had done. After her mum had died, she and her father had become close, relying on each other for company and advice. Somewhere, this had all changed, and for some reason Lexi couldn't fathom, it had happened without her being aware of the change. She stared at her father as she gathered herself. "I'll leave you and Gloria be then, Dad," she said quietly. "I'll ask Oliver Whimsy to fill me in on the details of the sale and the fine print, so that I know where, if anywhere, I stand." It was time she left and sorted out her life. She was obviously not the most important person in her father's life anymore, As much as she didn't like Gloria, the woman was her father's choice for his girlfriend, and Lexi knew she had to respect that decision. But she couldn't go, or even begin to move on, until she got to the bottom of how this had happened. "Don't worry, Dad, it's fine. I still don't understand what the hell you were thinking, selling Mum's cottages like that, and despite what Gloria said, I'm only too painfully aware that Mum's dead." She saw the hurt expression on his face, so added, "And despite your bravado in front of her, I know how it still hurts you." "It does, love." She took a shuddering breath, trying her best to remain calm in the face of his betrayal. "What happened to us, Dad? We used to be so close." He stared at her. For a moment she thought she had touched something she recognised. He opened his mouth to speak, then looked down at his feet. "Life moves on, love." "It certainly has done for us," she thought miserably. "Yes, but I just don't understand why you wouldn't speak to me about selling the cottages first. It was cruel and embarrassing to find out in the way I did." He glanced up at her but didn't reply. "Why did you go behind my back and sell them to Oliver Whimsy? Of all people. He isn't even from Jersey. How could you do that? And how is he entitled to buy property without qualifications?" She thought of the many people she had met over the years who would have given everything to be able to live on the island, but were stopped from doing so because they hadn't met the work and residential qualifications required to live in Jersey. It all seemed rather odd, as well as sudden. "My lawyers dealt with it all," her father said, shaking his head. "I don't quite understand everything that was said." Lexi stood at him silently. She wasn't surprised. He had always been hopeless with any form of administration or paperwork, preferring only to use paper for sketching on. His talents were purely for canvases and art of any kind, which was why she had been the one, after her mother had died, to deal with any administration to do with the cottages. It was another reason why she was still bemused by the fact that he had managed to go behind her back and sell the properties. Lexi thought back to Gloria's self-satisfied expression, and it dawned on her that it was as a result of a job well done. "Can I see the contracts, please, Dad?" "Why? You would only upset yourself seeing it in black and white." He shuffled from one foot to the other. "Because maybe, if I see it on paper, it might help it sink in that it's actually happened," she explained. "1 minute," he said, before walking out of the room. She waited silently for him to return, studying the room that had, until now, been as familiar to her as her hands. She could hear rustling and whispered conversation, but waited patiently for him to return. She had to obtain the contract now, before Gloria persuaded him not to let her see it. Lexi needed to know what had happened, and it looked like this was the only way. He marched back in to join her, brandishing a brown envelope. "It's in here." He opened it and withdrew what looked like a contract and handed it to Lexi. "I can't let you keep it, I'm afraid. I'll need to lock it away again in your mother's—" He blinked a few times at his slip of the tongue. "My desk. I have to keep it safe." Lexi quickly skimmed through the pages, taking in the amount the cottages were sold for, the fact that they were sold to a company on a date that was 1 week before. Then she turned the pages and saw her father's and Oliver Whimsy's names printed on the contract. Next to the names were both signatures. What stunned her was the name and signature of the witness for her father's signature. Gloria Sweeting. Lexi sighed heavily. "Well, that's done then." She handed her father the contract and turned to leave. "Wait." Her father followed her into the hall when she didn't do as he asked. She reached the front door, wanting to get away from him and his vile girlfriend, before the tears that were building up inside her began to escape and she made an exhibition of herself. "So much for trying to be understanding and move on with my life. How could they do this to me?" She put a hand on the handle to open it, and without looking back at her dad, swallowed to ease the tightening in her throat. "I'd better go and speak to Oliver Whimsy. In fact, he's waiting for me to buy him a few essentials from the shops, so I'd better do that first." Lexi stepped outside, slamming the door behind her. Not wishing to have to go back to her father's house for anything, she pulled the car keys from her coat pocket, got inside her car and drove the 50 metres to the nearest shop. Unable to hold back the tears any longer, she parked in a space as far away as possible from the shop so that no one could see her crying. Those cottages were such a huge connection to her mother. She hadn't ever considered that they would ever not be a part of her daily life. Lexi didn't know what was breaking her heart the most, the fact that the cottages and her home had gone, or that her father was instrumental in tearing apart her life. She gave in to her sobbing, unable to stop. A few minutes later, spent from the release of her emotions, she pulled a tissue out of her coat pocket and wiped the tears from her cheeks before blowing her nose. She took a deep breath and pulled down the sun visor to check her appearance in the mirror and grimaced. She looked like she was suffering from an allergic reaction to something nasty. Her eyes were puffy and swollen and her face pale. She couldn't possibly let anyone see her looking so revolting. Lexi wished she could simply go home and that she hadn't offered to buy essentials to Oliver bloody Whimsy. She opened the compartment under the dashboard on the passenger's side and took out her sunglasses. It was overcast, but she had no choice if she didn't want any gossip to start about why she was in such a state as soon as she had left the shop. There was a rapid knocking against her car window. The sudden unexpected sound gave Lexi a fright. She glanced up, horrified to have been caught in such a dishevelled state, to see Betty, a concerned expression on her gentle face. Lexi grabbed her purse and shopping bag and stepped out of the car. She quickly locked the door and turned to the oldest resident on the boardwalk. "It's freezing out here, Betty. What are you doing outside?" "Never mind me, lovely. What's the matter with you? I was watching you cry for a couple of minutes. I knew you needed to let go of whatever it was that had upset you so terribly. I didn't like to interrupt. You're usually such a cheerful little thing. Whatever it is must be bad." When Lexi found it difficult to get her words out, Betty added, "What's upset you so?" She took the old lady's hands in hers. They were freezing, despite the leather gloves she was wearing. Recovering from her distress, her thoughts now turned to Betty and getting her out of the cold. "Come on, Betty, you can't stay out here, it's freezing. Were you going to the shop?" Betty nodded. "Right, let's get you inside. I'll explain as we go in." She linked arms with Betty. The last thing Lexi needed was her lovely friend to slip over in the icy weather. She held the shop door open for her and followed her in, standing a metre inside near an overhead heater while she quietly relayed her woes. Betty listened in silence, her face a mask of concern. "I can't believe Jeff did such a dreadful thing." She took Lexi's hand in her tiny ones and gave them a gentle squeeze. "Your father always was the less sensible one in his relationship with your mother, but I never thought he'd be this silly." She lowered her voice further and added, "I suspect he's been infected by that woman friend of his. What's her name? Gloria?" Lexi nodded. "I think you mean influenced? And yes, I have to agree with you. I think he has been too. But what's done is done now. I've seen the contract. Oliver Whimsy, the man who came to the Halloween party, Jax's ex-girlfriend Nikki threw," she explained. "The one with all the drama and the proposal. Do you remember us telling you about it?" Betty thought for a moment before nodding. "I think I do, yes. He wasn't a very nice man either, was he? Whatever we all thought of Nikki, he shouldn't have left her standing in the middle of the dance floor like that," Lexi said, picking up a plastic basket and following Betty around the shop. "But I think he might have had his reasons." "She's not a nice girl either," Betty said, studying a carton of eggs. "Maybe they would have been well suited after all." She laughed quietly at her own joke. Lexi smiled. "I'm supposed to be getting him a few bits for the cottage," she said, grabbing a crusty loaf, carton of milk and a box of tea bags. "What can I do now?" she asked, overwhelmed by her situation, once again. Betty gave a reassuring smile. "Don't you fret, lovely," she said. "I know my place is small, but I'll always find a place for you there somewhere." Lexi put an arm around the older lady's narrow shoulders and gave her a hug. This was why she and everyone else on the boardwalk loved and respected Betty. Despite her being in her 90s, they could always rely on her to be there to offer words of kindness, good advice, or even a roof over their heads. "I'm sure it won't come to that," Lexi said, sounding more certain than she really felt. "After all, you've got Bella's mum, Claire, staying at your house, and she seems rather settled now that she's seeing Tony." "Well, yes. I'm not sure how long that will be lasting." "Why, what's happened?" Lexi asked, intrigued to know what she might be missing. "Never you mind that." Betty picked up a pint of milk and a packet of digestive biscuits. "Let's concentrate on you for the moment." "I'll be fine, honestly." She glanced at her watch and realised she had been longer than she had intended. She needed to get the shopping back to Oliver Whimsy. Lexi knew she was feeling more in control after her shocking meeting with her father, and was ready to discuss with Oliver how soon he was expecting her to remove her things from her cottage. As much as the thought devastated Lexi, she had no choice and couldn't put it off. It would only worry her if she didn't get organised as soon as possible. Betty took her free hand. "Look, Lexi, why not come back to my cottage? Let me make you a hot drink and we can talk about things." She smiled at her kindly friend. "Thank you, but I really must face this head on. I'll give you a lift home first, though." "If you're sure." "I am, thank you. Just let me pay for these things and I'll drop you off at the boardwalk." "That would be lovely." 10 minutes later, having dropped Betty off outside her home and carried a few bits of shopping in, Lexi drove back up the hill and parked the car in her allocated space. She braced herself and took the bag of shopping to Oliver's cottage. She knocked on the wooden door and, hearing his voice, walked in. "Sorry I took so long," she said. "My visit to my father took slightly longer than I imagined." He was leaning against the worktop in the kitchen area. "Don't worry. I've been thinking about what's happened and feel rather bad for my part in undermining you." "It was nothing to do with you," Lexi acknowledged, realising it wasn't fair to take it out on him. She placed a carrier bag onto the work surface. "Right, let's put these things away and then I'll leave you to it." He went back to whatever he'd been doing on his laptop. Lexi sensed him looking over at her every so often as she tidied up and wiped around the sink area. She hurriedly put everything away and took out a fresh tea towel, hanging it on the outside bar of the oven. "That's me finished then," she said. "I'll leave you to your admin. I'm going out for a bit, but feel free to come over to my, the cottage a bit later. We can talk through what you intend doing next and when you want me to move out." Without looking back or waiting for him to answer, Lexi left, closing the door behind her. Not bothering with the car, she zipped up her coat and walked down the hill. What was she going to do? She'd never considered leaving. It wasn't as if there were many places close to the boardwalk that would be available to rent or that she could afford, as properties close to the sea were expensive. She wiped away a stray tear and pushed her hands deep into her pockets against the biting wind. It broke Lexi's heart to think how much her life had changed in the last 2 years since her mother had died. It was so cold that ordinarily she would pace her way down the hill. Today, though, she was too lost in her thoughts to really notice the cold. She didn't wish to discuss what had happened with anyone else and was grateful that the freezing weather kept most people inside. Betty was the only person she was ready to speak to about her situation. Like Lexi's fishermen's cottages, the properties around the boardwalk, where her friends lived, were all tiny. Try as she might, she couldn't imagine any one of them would have enough room to take her in, especially since Bella's mum had moved in with Betty to help out when needed. Lexi would have to find somewhere to live, then fetch the boxes she'd been storing at her dad's. She was fairly sure she hadn't accumulated as much stuff as some of her friends had, like Bella with her antiques, or Jules with her second-hand books and her paintings. Lexi suspected she still had more than enough, though. She would need to find storage, not just for her own possessions, but those of her mother's she had been unable to part with. As Lexi descended the hill towards the boardwalk, the sound of the waves crashing against the sea wall below distracted her. She raised her gaze from the road to the beautiful grey and white tones of the waves as they broke over the rocks on the right-hand side of the boardwalk, and to the golden, damp sand on the beach in front of her. Lexi had always lived close enough to smell the sea and hear the waves, and didn't want to leave this place. But what else was she to do? Chapter 3. "Hey, Lexi!" She heard a muffled voice she recognised and looked over to see her friend Jules waving at her. Jules's short magenta hair was temporarily hidden under a bright orange bobble hat, and her mouth covered by a matching woolly scarf. Lexi tried to force a smile and failed. Jules caught up with her, and when she didn't receive Lexi's usual cheerful welcome, took her by the shoulders and stared into her eyes, scowling. Jules knew her well enough to know that if she couldn't speak, something major had happened in her life. Lexi forced a smile, and Jules's hand dropped to allow Lexi to resume walking. She was grateful to her friend for walking in silence next to her, allowing her time.